Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming down on this very special night. We are live from Books and Books in Coral Gables, Florida. A note for our live stream audience at home, if at any time during the presentation you'd like to purchase a copy of tonight's book, just call the number on your screen. We will take care of that for you. We will have the author sign it for you, and we will get it shipped to wherever you are in the United States free of charge. Well, this evening, Books and Books is honored to present Ms. Rachel Kushner and the softcover release of her highly acclaimed novel, The Flamethrowers. Ms. Kushner's debut novel, Telex from Cuba, was a finalist for the 2008 National Book Award and the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, winner of the California Book Award, a New York Times bestseller, and a New York Times notable book. The Flamethrowers has been equally acclaimed as a National Book Award finalist, New York Times bestseller, and one of the New York Times 10 best books of 2013. This book has gotten fantastic reviews. I have a quote here from one of the good friends of Books and Books and one of our favorite novelists, Robert Stone. He said, "The controlled intensity and perception in Rachel Kushner's novels mark her as one of the most brilliant writers of the oncoming century. She's going to be one we turn to for our serious pleasures and for the insight and wisdom we'll be needing in hard times to come." Rachel Kushner is a novelist of the very first order. The Flamethrowers follows Telex from Cuba as a masterful work. And if that doesn't convince you, I have a quote from another one of our favorite writers here at Books and Books, Colin McCann. He said, "I'd walk 500 miles for her next book." Please give a very warm welcome to Ms. Rachel Kushner.
Oh, I have a microphone on me. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for that wonderful introduction, and thanks to Mitchell and everyone for coming tonight. I never heard that term soft cover. It's so much nicer than paperback. It fits with a sensuous Coral Gables environment. In any case, I'm going to read a section of this, my new novel, The Flamethrowers. If you haven't read the book, I think all you need to know is that the narrator is a young woman who moves to New York City in the mid-1970s. And the passage I will read is from right after she arrives, and she knows no one in New York. She was given the phone number of one person who she vaguely knew in art school in Reno, Nevada, and called the number and it was disconnected. And she's just been spending her time kind of wandering around, very isolated. And she meets these two people in a bar. She's very lonely, and they strike up a conversation with her. They're kind of dissolute-seeming people, but she's lonely enough that she takes up their offer to buy her a drink. Their names are Thurman and Nadine, and she's with them and their friend, whose name she somehow didn't learn. We piled into the car with drinks in our hands. Nadine had picked hers up and carried it toward the bar's exit. And following behind, I thought, oh yeah, of course, this is how it's done. Thurman paid our tab, and I was with them in a Cadillac Eldorado, heavy rocks glasses in our hands, damp cocktail napkins underneath, the ice in our glasses tinking as the car turned slow corners, honking so people would get out of our way, because we were important in that car, me on their handsome friend's lap, our drinks going to-tink, to-tink. "This is my favorite," the friend said, pulling a leather date book from a pocket in the door. "It actually comes with the car, the 1957 Cadillac Brome's own date book. And this," he said, pulling out a perfume bottle from a little cubby in the armrest, "the Lanvin Cologne Atomizer with Arpege perfume. You could order this stuff at the GM dealership when these models were new. Thurman, what else is this thing loaded with?" "Beats me," Thurman said. "Blossom was willed the car. It belonged to Lady Von Doyle. This blossom had been mentioned several times now. I didn't ask who she was, who any of the people they mentioned were. I wanted to study the way they spoke, not interrupt the flow, be the person they had to stop and explain things to. Their friend reached back into the armrest and retrieved a leather-bound flask with a big GM symbol on it, opened it, and sniffed. "Scotch," he said. "This is true post-Calvinist delirium. Like the Jews at Sammy's Romanian, eating steaks that hang off the plates, a big pitcher of chicken schmaltz on the table. It's all about never going hungry again." He poured from the flask into our glasses. I felt the presence of his body as he leaned. "I think Lady Von Doyle was Jewish," Nadine said. "Thurman, wasn't she Jewish?" The friend said that seemed about right for a Jew to drive a Cadillac. "In a sense," he said, "there is simply this axis of General Motors and Volkswagen. I myself have a VW Bug, a car we associate with Eugene McCarthy and flower power, and not with Hitler, who created it. The VW doesn't make you think of Hitler and genocide. It's a breast on wheels, a puffy little dream. The Cadillac, now, that's a different dream. Of the two, you'd expect the Cadillac would represent some unspeakable horror, crimes against humanity. Look, here's the Brome powder puff, the lipstick case, the pill dispenser, the Evans pocket mirror. All that's missing is the Tiffany cocaine vial and a chrome-plated .44 Magnum." "Keep looking," Thurman said. "Ha ha, right, but you would never be tempted to chrome a .44 Magnum, Thurm. That's strictly for rednecks and off-duty cops. My point is that compared to the humble little Volkswagen, the GM seems guiltier, more dissolute, and yet there's no genocide or forced labor camps under this leather upholstery, just cotton wool batting, itself, unlike the beautiful car, not built to last. But these days, only people in the ghetto think it's uptown to drive a Cadillac. In fact, only people in the ghetto think in terms of uptown and downtown. Are you aware there's an oil crisis? I don't even drive my Bug anymore with the price of gas," their friend said. "I got my little Harley." "I ride motorcycles," I said. "I mean, I used to, but I sold mine." He looked at me. I was seated sideways on his lap. "You do have a kind of tomboy allure, I might call it. Yeah." "Okay," I told myself. "Something is starting to happen with this guy." "What kind?" "What?" I asked. "What kind of bike did you ride?" "Oh, a Motovalera." See, this fits in with my general thesis. It just so happens I know one of them, though he's not involved with the company. I like to rib him about those calendars they print. They pretend this name, Valera, is about firm Italian tits and desmodromic valves, but actually they used Polish slave labor to make killing machines for the Nazis. Perhaps not specifically, not exactly, but they used some kind of X to make a Y, fill in your human cost, and slick modern contraption of choice. "But mine was a 65, I said, way after the war." "Which makes it innocent," he said, "just like you." He touched his hand to my cheek, quick and glancing. "You don't have it anymore, the Motovalera?" "I sold it to move here." X for Y. He had placed his hand on my waist, and I felt heat issue from it, and with that heat, something else, something sincere flowing from him to me, a message or meaning that was different in tone from the way he spoke. I turned toward him. "Do you want to know something funny?" I said it quietly, not wanting Nadine and Thurman to hear. "Yes," he whispered back, and moved his hand from my waist to my leg. There wasn't really any other place for him to put it in that crowded back seat, and yet I read the gesture of his hand on my leg as exactly that. A man's hand on a woman's leg, and not a hand that had no other place to rest itself. I don't remember your name, I whispered. That is funny, he whispered back. We carried our drinks into a crowded bar, a Spanish place on the ground floor of a hotel, full of color and noise and people they knew. A man called Duke, with root beer-colored chandelier lusters hooked onto his shirt, came rushing toward us. He said the lusters were from the Hotel Earl. You're the Duke of Earl, Nadine said. I'm the Duke of Earl, he said, and shimmied his crystals. People crowded around them to say hello. I had the sudden feeling they would shed me. I was a stranger they had picked up in an empty bar, and I was irrelevant now that they'd found their place in a familiar scene. Their friend steered us to an empty booth. I slid in next to him. The Duke of Earl joined us. We ordered drinks, and the friend punched in selections on the remote jukebox console. Roy Orbison's voice entered the room like a floating silk ribbon. My mother had his records, I said to the friend. Your mother had good taste, Reno. Oh, he calls her Reno because that's where she's from. That voice and the hair, black as melted down record vinyl. Someone passed the Duke a big bottle of soap solution, and he and Nadine took turns dragging on their cigarettes and then blowing huge organ-shaped bubbles. The bubbles were filled with milk-white smoke from their cigarettes, quivering and luminous, floating downward as Thurman photographed them. The next table over wanted the soap. The Duke blew one final bubble of plain lung air. It was clear and shiny, and everyone watched as it drifted and sank, popping to nothing on the edge of our table. You chose this one, didn't you? Thurman said to their friend as a new song came on. It was Green Onions by Booker T and the MGs. It's still a good song, the friend said, even if it was stuck in my head for almost a decade. He turned to me and said he'd been in jail. Not a decade, just 30 days. I asked what for. He said for transporting a woman across state lines, and Nadine erupted in laughter. I smiled, but had no sense of the coordinates, of what was funny and why. The Mann Act, he said. Impure intent. What is impure intent? I did some time, and then I was free, but my head was jailed in this song, so it was like I did a lot more time. He hummed along with Green Onions, nodding his head. At first it wasn't so bad. Green Onions was this special secret, something I was hiding, like a pizza cutter up my sleeve. I was pulling one over on them, jamming out to Green Onions while my fellow inmates were getting their cold shower, eating their pimento loaf, reading letters from women who wanted husbands on a short leash, a really short leash. The men wrote back to these lonely women and did push-ups and waited for the women to come a-courting on Visitors' Day with their fried chickens and their plucked eyebrows. He had helped the other inmates write their letters to the women. Reach out to your loved ones, 39 cents, a sign in the common room said. You got an envelope, paper, and a stamp. These guys would be working away with a little pencil like they give you for writing down call numbers at the public library. How do you spell pussy? They'd ask. How do you spell breasts? Does penis have an I in it? What was the pizza cutter for? Nadine asked. For cutting pizza, sweet Nadine. He gave her a puppy dog smile. When I got out, I thought, okay, unlike a lot of my friends, I know what the inside of a prison is like. Most people don't even know what the outside of a prison is like. They're kept so out of sight, you only know signs on the highway warning you not to pick up hitchers. Well, I know about confinement and boredom and midnight fire drills, amplified orders banging around the prison yard like the evening prayer call from the mosques on Atlantic Avenue. I know pimento loaf, powdered eggs, riots, the experience of being hosed down with bleach and disinfectant like a garbage can. I know about an erotics of necessity. Oh, baby, the Duke of Earl said. There's something in that. You think you're one way, strictly into women, but it turns out you're strictly into making do. I am going to melt, the Duke said. Just puddle right in this booth. I had no idea. I don't want to disappoint you, Duke, the friend said, but I'd have to be in prison, and I don't plan on going back. His arm was around me. I was in the stream that had moved around me since I'd arrived in New York. It had moved around me and not let me in, and suddenly here I was at this table, plunged into a world, everything moving swiftly but not passing me by. I was with the current, part of it, regardless of whether I understood the codes, the shorthand of the people around me. Not asking or needing to know kept me with them, moving at their pace. When you get released, they dump you in Queens Plaza at 4 a.m. Guys are darting in and out of the donut shop, wedded in some deep way to prison cafeteria code, drinking coffee, holding a donut in a greasy bag like they've got a bomb, strutting, but unsure who they're strutting for now that there's no guard, no warden, no cellmate. They are just random dudes in Queens Plaza, wonderfully, horribly free. That same hour of the night, women and children line up in Midtown to get bussed out to Rikers for Visitors' Day. Buses letting out felons here, collecting visiting day passengers there, while most people are sleeping. The prisons must stay hidden geographically, and hidden in time, too. After I got out, he said, I was incredibly happy. Freedom after confinement is different from plain freedom, which can sometimes be its own sort of prison. The problem was green onions. Weeks turned to months, and it hung around. The surging rhythm was always in my head, and I mean always. He hummed it. It woke me up in the middle of the night, like someone had turned up the volume, and there I was, lying in the dark, listening to the tweedling Green Onions organ riff, waiting for the guitar parts to cut in, stuck inside its driving rhythm, this groovy song boring out the canals of my brain. It was so unfair, because I had paid my debt to society. Green Onions came on again, for I think the third time, and it felt to me that the whole room was conspiring in some kind of hoax. The friend hummed enthusiastically. If you had to hear it for 10 whole years, I said, laughing, figuring if I laughed openly, he would stop putting me on. How can you stand to listen to it now? Because you have to know your enemies, he said. How can you fight if you don't know what you're up against? Who are your enemies? I said I didn't know. See? Exactly. Later we danced. My arms were around his neck, his t-shirt clinging to his broad shoulders in the heat and sweat of the bar. I had not kissed him, but I knew I would, and he knew that I knew, and there was some kind of mutual joy in this slide into inevitability, never mind that I didn't know his name, or if anything he said was true. You're pretty, he said, brushing my hair away from my face. How did you find people in New York City? I hadn't known this would be how. They could put your face on cake boxes, he said. I smiled. Until you show that gap between your teeth, Jesus, it sort of ruins your cake box appeal, but actually it enhances a different sort of appeal. Some women wouldn't want a man to speak to them that way. They'd say, "What kind of appeal do you mean?" Or they'd say, "Go fuck yourself." But I'm not those women, and when he said it, my heart surged a little. The hotel, it turned out, was the Chelsea. I don't know whose room it was. Maybe it was Nadine's, a room that Thurman got for her. There was the sense that Thurman helped her out when he felt like it, and that perhaps she was out on the street when he didn't. We were drinking from a bottle of Cutty Sark, and Nadine was not, it turned out, Thurman's wife. From a phone pulled into the hallway, he spoke with his actual wife, Blossom. Or maybe he just called her that, not at all tenderly, a nasal, "Blossom, I will call you in the morning." He enunciated each word like the sentence was a lesson the wife was meant to memorize and repeat. "In the morning. I will call you tomorrow, after I've had my Sanka." Which sent Nadine into hysterics. Sanka! After he's had his Sanka! After he got off the phone, Thurman seemed energized by a new wildness, as if the compromise of the phone call had to be undone with behavior that Blossom, wherever she was, might not approve of. He put on a Bo Diddley record with the volume turned all the way up, and when it began to skip, he pulled it from the turntable and threw it out the window. He put on another record, a song that went, "There is Something on Your Mind," over and over, with this clumsy but sexy saxophone hook. At the friend's suggestion, I danced with Thurman. He smelled like aftershave and cigarettes and hair tonic. There was something synthetic and unnatural about him, the way his hair formed a perfect wave, and the crispness of his fitted suit, clothing that kept him who he was, a person of some kind of privilege through whatever degraded environment or level of drunkenness. The friend was dancing with Nadine. Her arms were slung around his neck, her strawberry hair over his shoulder. She pressed her hips against him, and he pressed back. Watching their bodies make contact, I wished we could trade partners. "Well, look at that," Thurman said. "Take your eyes off her for just a minute." I felt him fumble for something in his suit jacket. Nadine and their friend turned as a unit, slowly one way and then the other. Before I understood what it was Thurman had retrieved from his coat pocket, something body-warm, heavy, he was aiming it at them, at the friend and Nadine, who danced to the slow rhythm of the song, pressed together and unaware. I heard a click. He was pointing it at them. A deafening bang ripped through me. The friend laughed and asked for the gun, and Thurman tossed it in his direction. The friend opened it and took out the bullets and inspected them. "Blanks," he said, and gave it back to Thurman, who grabbed Nadine by the neck in mock violence and stroked the front of her dress up and down with the gun barrel. It seemed a stupid and ridiculous gesture, but she took it seriously and even moaned a little, like it turned her on. I remembered my cousins Scott and Andy saying blanks could kill a person. Thurman put the gun in a cabinet and brought out a new bottle of Cutty Sark. He poured us fresh drinks and then played "Will the Circle Be Unbroken" on the little electric piano that was in the room. Later, he barged into the bathroom while Nadine was peeing. For some reason, not in the toilet, but in the bathtub. He looked at her, sitting at the edge of the tub with her mini dress hoisted up. "You know what I love more than anything?" he said. "What?" She asked it with quiet reverence, as if the whole evening were a ritual enacted in order to arrive at this moment when Thurman would finally tell her what he really loved. "I love crazy little girls." He grabbed her and hoisted her over his shoulder, her underpants still around her ankles, carried her into the bedroom, and shut the door. "You know what they do?" the friend said. "They shoot each other with that gun. In the crotch. Bang. Pow. It makes your eardrums feel ripped in half the next day." "Isn't that dangerous?" I asked. "Of course, that's why they do it." The gun went off. Nadine shrieked with laughter. The telephone in the room began ringing. The friend and I sat quietly, either waiting for the next gunshot or for the phone to stop ringing, or for something else. "Hey," he said. "Hey, Reno, come here." But I was already right next to him. That's the end of that section. I don't know. Maybe that's enough. I'm happy to entertain questions, if anybody should have one. Yes.
In writing your novels, are there any kind of specific maybe books that you have in mind, not necessarily as influences so much as maybe that you want to achieve a similar feeling of, or that made you feel a certain way that you want to kind of recreate in your readers?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, maybe not so intentionally or consciously, but I think one is drawing from a well of that all the time in writing. And I think, and the education probably of every writer is that feeling of pleasure when you're reading. And so then when you go to write, there would really almost be no other reason to do it, except to try to evoke some feeling that you felt yourself as a reader. I think there are mysterious affinities that happen between reader and writer. So certainly there are writers that I have felt an affinity for and a huge amount of admiration for, but I wouldn't try to produce the same effects that they've produced, because once something gets filtered down through the mind and sensibility of another writer, it just comes out in a different way. And I think the real force, at least for me, of novel writing is trying to put into action, like to activate these things about my own sensibility that are unique to me. But that's like a really long and overly fancy answer. I mean, there are writers that I love, but I don't claim to produce work that would bear their marks of influence. So I feel careful about that, because I wouldn't want to say, well, Proust and Faulkner, and because everybody does that, and all writers usually are reading these great. I'm a real rereader. It's strange. I flew here today, and on the plane I was reading Celine, Journey to the End of the Night, and this book by Curzio Malaparte called The Skin that just got republished by New York Review Books Classics. And I was reading it when I was writing this book, and I saw things in it that I had kind of slurped up, but transmutated into my own thing, so that I don't think anyone would ever recognize the influence. But there was more there than I even knew of, because I was reading it when I was writing my book. I mean, some things I can read and then I don't connect to them or adopt anything or learn from it in any way. And other things, it's just profound for me, and I go back to those same things over and over again. Like, I brought that up because I've read that Malaparte novel, The Skin, and Celine's Journey to the End of the Night, 5 times each or something. And I should just be branching out and reading new things, but I tend to return to the same. There's certain texts that I love, and of living writers, or recently dead. Bolaño was a big deal for me when Savage Detectives came out. That really, I think, changed the landscape of what was possible. So, yeah.
I have a question. I first read The Flamethrowers and then went to read Telex from Cuba. And what struck me was it seemed like so much research would be required to really place the story and the characters in those contexts with all those details. And I just wonder how much, Italian, countercultural things in the 70s, how do you go about kind of absorbing, and it's like they come out so second nature, as if you were there,
Well, thanks for reading both my books. That's a commitment. They came together really differently. I mean, with the first as a kind of counterpoint, I was trying to teach myself how to write a novel, and it took me a long time to do that. Not to say that I've learned, but over the course of that first book, I did tons of research because I wanted to understand everything about Cuba and the kind of incredibly Baroque political history of the formation of the country and the Haitian Revolution and all the literature that came out of the Caribbean. And so I just immersed myself in that world for years, and then tried to pull back from it and create a novel, which is a totally different thing than building something that's based on learning. For me, it's not at all like essay writing or creative nonfiction, nothing like that. So I feel like I did my stint applying myself to a world and building a novel from it. And this book was very different. It was an occasion for me to kind of work with bodies of knowledge that I had just picked up in a much more natural way over the course of life. Like the autonomy is something that the Italian leftist political movement that is one of the environments in the book, the second half of the book. That's just a world that I was interested in, and I know people who were involved with it. And I started just thinking it was just a kind of, there's just so much to learn about it, and now there's more. It's kind of become hip in like ultra-left circles to know about Italy in the 70s. But when I was working on this book, it wasn't at all. But I spent a lot of time in Italy, and so I started asking people there about it. And it turned out that every single person, I know a lot of people in the art world, like kind of like well-heeled dealers in Milan, et cetera. And even they had been radicals in the 70s. Like everyone had been involved in autonomia. And you would ask people about someone else, and they'd say, oh, yes, I helped him escape into France. And it's because they arrested so many people in Italy. It was incredible. So that was something that I just became interested in. And with the art world, I have written about contemporary art for a long time. And knowing about the art scene in the 70s, I know what I read didn't reflect anything of that. It was just this weird night with these people. But
no, it was just like that.
Okay, well,
like that was another thing. Like to me, these were such disparate, motorcycle riding in the desert, and then the Italian part, and then the feeling of being like in Soho at night in the 70s on the street with these like art world characters. It was so,
Oh, that's nice. Yeah. Well, I know a lot of people in the art world, and I think I'd love to listen to the way they talk. And I didn't use anything, really, that people said to me, but I adopted the cadence of their voices, and it's one of the pleasures of writing. And like you said, something about it's so disparate. But I feel like being a person is pretty disparate on some level. And the novel is an occasion to try to figure out how to put things into play against one another. But for my taste, the kind of novel that I like to write is not to braid them together too tightly at the end and make everything fit perfectly, because that feels fictitious. Sure. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm curious about the name of the book, Flamethrowers. Can you talk about that?
I'm not very good at titles, and I wish I could claim that I came up with this title, because I do like it. It seems to have sort of fit the sensibility of the book. But my editor, Nan Graham, came up with the title for the book. When she read the manuscript over the course of a weekend, then she texted me at the end of the weekend and said, I want to call this book The Flamethrowers. And I thought, great. It fits. It seems now I've had a lot of time to see the different ways in which it works for the book. So, there's a long section, I don't know if you've read the book, there's a long section near the end about these Italian shock troops in World War I called the Arditi, and one of the regiments of the Arditi are flamethrowers, and I had a manual that was like all the different troops of the Arditi. I think these manuals are for people who collect military memorabilia. I mean, this is like a very, very particular world of collecting, and these people know everything, and I know nothing. But I had this book that has illustrations of the uniforms that they wear, and the different kinds of knives and guns that they carry, and the types of grenades that they use, and it's all incredibly elaborate. And then there was like 6 pages devoted to the flamethrowers, and they wear these asbestos suits. It looks like a burqa, basically. It's like a sweater and a hood, and then they carry these huge tanks on their back. And I just became interested in them. I started reading up about them, and they don't go over well in prisoner of war camp. So they're never spared, and they're kind of the sad creatures. I was thinking, just like hulking across the landscape in World War I. They move very slowly, and so the rest of the other regiments. I'm sorry, I don't really know anything about the military. Now, see, I'm not an expert at that, but are trained, if flamethrowers get into trouble, they're not even meant to give them any backup. They just desert. And then they were phased out. The United States used them in the military up through the Vietnam War and then phased them out because they're just really bad for public relations. So that was one aspect of it. But, I don't know. I told a friend of mine the title in New York City, and he's a guy who writes mostly about opera. And he thought it was a reference to these kind of tall tale tellers in the book, like throwing fire. So it seems to work in different ways. And there hadn't been another book called that, so.
What was your working title before she named it?
Oh, yeah, a lot of people have asked me that recently. I think it's not a bad title, but I just think, I only show, not my slip, just what I've prepared for the public. Was there another question?
Another hand around here, someone had their hand up.
Rachel, I have a question. Can you talk a little bit about your journey from where you grew up, which was in Portland and San Francisco, and what it felt like to go to Columbia when you went to New York, and the different worlds that they represent to you?
Sure. But I'll begin maybe with a caveat that I'm really nothing like the narrator of my novel. I'm actually from Eugene, Oregon, which is a little different. We never went to Portland, Oregon, which is, I guess, the big city, but we somehow, people from Eugene, that's a very specific kind of hippie place to be from in the early 70s. If you're from there, then everybody knows your parents were smoking a lot of dope. So yeah, I grew up in Eugene, and then we moved to San Francisco, and then I went to an MFA program at Columbia, but I didn't go until I was 26, which now is pretty normal, but at the time was older. And I had spent the years prior to that riding motorcycles in San Francisco and racing them and working on them, which didn't please my parents a whole lot. But my dad had been a gearhead when I was growing up, so he had no one to blame but himself. And then I moved to New York, and I guess in a way that relates to this book, one thing I could share maybe about my experience there, it's come up in the way I've been asked about the art, my relationship to the art world. I entered this writing program, and the writers in the program were fine, but I never felt like writers, just for being writers, automatically had a set of things in common with one another. Now I meet certain writers I have a ton in common with, but it's because we all have books, and then your book is like a whole calling card to who you are. And then you read their book and write them a letter, and then it turns out you have a lot to say to one another. But just starting out, like, oh, you read Jane Austen, I read, Celine. It's just hard to figure out how to form social relations. And I met some artists through friends, and I was just immediately very seduced by that world, because I found that people read quite a lot, and they were interested in writers, but none of them were writers, but they just knew a lot about culture broadly, like music and art and sculpture and art history and philosophy. And it was exciting to me, and a lot of them were older than I was, so it was a good education. I spent several years there, and then eventually I moved away from New York City. But there was a gallerist in New York that I learned a lot from. I mean, there are many people I learned a lot from there, but this guy named Hudson, and he ran Feature Gallery, and he was the first person to give the artist Richard Prince a show. And he actually just died 2 weeks ago, really tragically. Just shouldn't have died at his age, but yeah, there were these great figures in New York City that I learned a lot from. Any other questions, or should we?
Anyone else? Well then, thank you very much, Rachel. Great.
Thank you.
Just skim a message. All right, so a reminder for our internet audience, there's still time to call the number on your screen. Purchase a copy of the Flamethrowers. We'll have Ms. Kushner sign it for you, and we will mail it to you free of charge anywhere in the U.S. Also, all of our live streamed events are archived, so you could go to the Books and Books website, go to the live streaming link, and anything that we've filmed here at the store will be archived there for you to watch at your convenience. For those of you here in the store, we have the Flamethrowers in hardcover and softcover, as well as Telex from Cuba, for sale at the counter over there. Rachel's going to be signing here at this table to the left of the podium, and that was such a treat. Why don't we give Rachel another hand? Thanks very much.